I find it a little bit strange that he should deign to call himself, brazenly call himself, or at least imply some kind of champion for free speech or free expression.
Look, I've probably got to answer that. You'll have noticed, and all of your viewers will have noticed, that this Islamist lunatic in your studio can't answer the basic question. Let's try it again and make it simple for you. Why don't you say whether or not you are completely condemning of any violence against Salman Rushdie or anyone else who is deemed to have said something heretical? Why don't we start with the basics for you?
Douglas Murray storms onto the show with a fierce declaration. We don't need Islam. He doesn't hold back, diving straight into the heart of one of the most heated issues of our time, terrorism and its links to Islam. Get ready for a clash of ideologies and beliefs. Nothing is off limits.
You said at the beginning, is there any limit to free speech? And I'm rather disturbed we're still discussing this. It's 3 decades and more since the Satanic Verses affair. It was in 1989 that the Ayatollah Khomeini did the unpardonable, unforgivable thing of calling for the murder of a British novelist for the crime of writing a novel. And we had these debates back then. Where are the limits to free speech? Has Mr. Rushdie committed a crime as well as the Ayatollah? And a lot more guff like that. I'm rather disturbed that in all of the decades since, with all of the people who've been killed for asserting their right to free speech, or asserting their right to say what they think and to for the rest of us to hear it, but we're still at this elementary playground level of discussion. I'm sorry to say that, but this is a long answered question. Our societies have perfectly good incitement laws in place. The rest of it, I'm sorry, no, we're not adapting our own speech codes. We're not going to make ourselves more sensitive to people who famously burn books that they can't even read. I mean, the Ayatollah Khomeini had never even read the Satanic Verses when he asked for Muslims around the world to kill Salman Rushdie. It's an unpardonable thing that has happened. It is extraordinary to me that we're still having this discussion. Mm-hmm. We had the same discussion 7 years ago when the cartoonists of Charlie Hebdo were being murdered. We had the same discussion in all of these decades, and it's Muslims and non-Muslims who've been attacked. And we in the West still have this pathetic discussion about, what are the limits of free speech? Really, we've got to get better than that.
Murray's take on free speech is far too black and white, stripping away the nuance needed for such a complex issue. While he champions absolute free speech, the reality is that no society allows speech without limits. We have laws against incitement to violence and hate for a reason, to protect people from real harm. Murray's dismissal of these boundaries as mere sensitivity is dangerously naive. Unchecked speech can ignite violence, as history shows time and again. It's not about bending to those who burn books, but about preventing speech that stokes hatred and tears apart social cohesion. And no, the West's free speech laws aren't some perfect blueprint that fits every culture. Societies with different histories and values deserve the right to define their own limits. Murray's fixation on the Salman Rushdie affair is equally oversimplified. The fatwa was an outrageous act, but the backlash wasn't just about a book. It was rooted in deep colonial wounds, identity, and power dynamics.
We have an on-off button. If you want to go and see a comedian, you buy a ticket. If you want to watch a television program, you pick that channel. If you want to read Salman Rushdie's book, you surely have a right. Are we not getting to the point where free speech is under attack in our world, in our nation?
It's been under attack for a long time. I don't particularly care for a lot of the sort of belly aching and complaining on rather frivolous online stuff that I hear from a lot of authors and others. I think that people have to toughen up a bit on some of that. But the Rushdie affair has always been in a different class, and there's a reason for that. And there's a reason why so many people today are willing to make death threats against authors and others for all sorts of things, including comedians. And it's because they saw that it works. Yeah. It works. When the Ayatollah called for the murder of Salman Rushdie, people on the left and right of British politics and of British culture made excuses for the fatwa. I'm sure we'll hear some excuses today. They learned, our societies learned, that if somebody says, I'm offended, and then says, and as a result I'm going to kill, you better be damn sure that you're willing to die for that. And unfortunately, the success of the Ayatollah's fatwa, among other things, is that it showed a load of other disgruntled people what they could do if they only had the disgustingness to think that they could exercise violence as an opposition to the pen. And I'm afraid that what happened, as I say, is that Muslim extremists across the UK and across the world showed they could intimidate people, and others undoubtedly have learned from this. But let's remember, Britain in 1989, we allowed Muslims in Bradford to burn the Quran, the satanic verses on the streets of Britain. We allowed prominent figures like Cat Stevens to excuse the murder of Salman Rushdie on the television. We allowed Iranian officials who had called for Rushdie's murder to live in London. Like, how stupid are we?
Murray's argument falls flat by painting the fatwa against Salman Rushdie as a turning point that weakened Western resolve on free speech. He claims that allowing protests like the burning of the satanic verses somehow legitimized violence, but this is a gross oversimplification. Even when it involves something as provocative as burning a book, protesting is an exercise of free speech. Just as Rushdie had the right to write his novel, Muslims in the UK had the right to express their anger. To equate peaceful protest with the incitement of violence is misleading and ignores the critical distinction between free expression and real threats. Murray's view that allowing these protests showed weakness misses the mark entirely. In reality, giving space for grievances to be aired helps diffuse tension, not escalate it. Silencing marginalized groups doesn't prevent radicalization, it fuels it.
Quite a strong rhetoric from Douglas Murray. I'm always aware that Muslim extremists do not in any way speak for the majority of Muslims. But to be fair, the Iranian government over the weekend said Rushdie was to blame for being attacked. That is completely and utterly despicable, isn't it?
Well, firstly, I find it rather strange that Douglas Murray, who's had a history of advocating for restrictions on Muslim speakers at universities...
But you can answer my question. Do you think it's despicable that the Iranian government have said that he took it on himself? He was stabbed in broad daylight. Do you find that despicable?
But if I may, he deigns to say he's a champion for free speech, so to speak, but yet his organisation argued for restrictions on for platforms for Muslim speakers going to universities. He wanted to ban the burqa in public buildings and a kind of social ban on it in public. So for him, and argued that conditions for Muslims in Europe must be made harder across the board.
Let's bring Douglas back in. Douglas, wait.
I find it a little. I find it a little bit strange that he should deign to call himself, brazenly call himself, or at least imply he's some kind of champion for free speech. Or free expression.
Look, I've probably got to answer that. You'll have noticed, and all of your viewers will have noticed, that this Islamist lunatic in your studio can't answer the basic question. Let's try it again and make it simple for you. Why don't you say whether or not you are completely condemning of any violence against Salman Rushdie or anyone else who is deemed to have said something heretical? Why don't we start with the basics for you?
Al-Andalusi makes a valid and crucial point about the inconsistency in Douglas Murray's stance on free speech. While Murray positions himself as a staunch defender of free expression, Al-Andalusi rightfully calls out his track record of advocating for restrictions specifically targeted at Muslims. Murray's support for banning the burqa in public spaces and his push to limit Muslim speakers at universities directly contradict his proclaimed dedication to free speech. Free expression must apply universally, not selectively, and targeting specific religious or cultural practices undermines the very principles Murray claims to uphold. Moreover, Al-Andalusi's challenge to Murray isn't about avoiding the issue of condemning violence. It's about exposing the hypocrisy in Murray's arguments. Al-Andalusi is right to highlight this contradiction. You can't claim to be a defender of free speech while simultaneously working to suppress the voices and practices of a particular group. Free speech means standing up for everyone's right to express themselves, even those you disagree with.
Okay, firstly, I want to answer his question, because he asked me first, which is about the Iranian regime. Well, having not being an Iranian citizen nor participated in any elections to elect the Iranian regime, The Iranian regime doesn't really represent 1.8 billion Muslims. And
Okay, so if you're here representing 1.8 billion Muslims, it's very simple. Douglas has just said it. All right, as your own self, having heard what he said, do you accept people saying, be it the Iranian government or Muslim extremists, and I made the caveat and I repeat it, Muslim extremists, that one of the biggest problems I have is that people look at the whole thing and they shouldn't. Do you agree with anybody who comes up with the sentence, he was to blame for being knifed in broad daylight 15 times in his neck? Do you?
The only person to blame for the knifing of Salman Rushdie is the assailant himself.
Not the Iranian regime who put the fatwa on him in the first place.
Well, unless you can demonstrate that they were specifically colluding or they sent an agent.
They said he was to blame.
He was in communication with the Iranian Revolutionary Guard.
That's their opinion.
Al-Andalusi makes a compelling argument when he clarifies that the Iranian regime does not represent the views of 1.8 billion Muslims worldwide. It's crucial to distinguish between the actions of specific governments or extremist factions and the beliefs of the global Muslim community. The Iranian government's stance, including its fatwa against Salman Rushdie, is not reflective of all Muslims, and it's irresponsible to generalize the views of a diverse religious group based on the actions of a few. Al-Andalusi is right to highlight this distinction, emphasizing that extremist voices should not define the entire faith. Furthermore, Al-Andalusi correctly asserts that the sole person responsible for the attack on Rushdie is the assailant himself. Blaming an entire community or even an entire regime for an individual's violent act misrepresents the situation. Unless there's clear evidence of direct involvement or collusion, the responsibility lies with the attacker, not with any external group or government.
But I'm only here to talk about, if you're asking me who's to blame, I say the assailant, much like Douglas Murray said that the Christchurch killer, the one who massacred the Muslims in the mosque, but only the killer was to blame, not those who radicalized him into viewing Muslims as a threat to the West.
What you'll find is that if somebody put millions of dollars on someone's head, yours, for instance, or mine, and somebody then attacked us, you would think that the person who had put millions of dollars on our head would bear some responsibility. But because you're such a dishonest weasel, you're not even willing to do that. You're not even willing to do the basic thing of condemning the attack.
Sticks and stones, Douglas Murray, sticks and stones.
Why don't we
You need to demonstrate that the person was motivated by the reward.
I'll tell you what I'd like to motivate. I'll tell you what I'd like.
Al-Andalusi nails it by putting the spotlight where it truly belongs, on the assailants themselves, not on entire communities or governments. His argument is spot on. When it comes to violent attacks, the responsibility falls squarely on the individuals who commit these heinous acts, not on broader groups or regimes that might have made inflammatory statements. Murray's attempt to shift the blame to entire communities or governments is both unfair and dangerously divisive. Al-Andalusi is right to push back against this reckless generalization. Linking the actions of extremists to the whole Muslim community or any other group is a blatant move to stir up more division and hostility. Just as the Christchurch shooter's vile acts are the responsibility of the shooter alone, so too are the violent acts of the Rushdie attacker. Al-Andalusi's call for focusing on individual accountability and condemning the actual perpetrators of violence is the clear, just stance. It's about cutting through the noise and making sure we hold the right people responsible, not letting Murray's scapegoating agenda cloud the real issues.
If you are through a group or a clan or whatever you want to say, and I'm treading carefully for obvious reasons, if you feel that you're following a group, whatever it is, and they're telling you to do something, you're sitting there saying that bloke wasn't. I mean,
isn't that my free will, though? Isn't the whole basis of the Western system based on people's free will?
Do you believe that man would have gone and stabbed Salman Rushdie unless he had been encouraged, incentivized, galvanized, whatever words you want, from people, the Iranian government, who say Salman Rushdie is to blame on putting a fatwa on his head? That's wrong,
I'm simply saying that, unlike knee-jerk dog whistle politics we hear from Douglas Murray, why don't we wait to the court case to see what motivated the individual? I'm waiting for the evidence. I'm waiting to, what does he say motivated him? If he said it was motivated by the Iranian government fatwa, fine, I accept.
Do you not think he might have been? I guess is the question.
Yeah, he might have been.
Al-Andalusi is absolutely on point when he questions the simplistic notion that individual actions occur in a vacuum. The notion that someone would have violently attacked Salman Rushdie without the intense influence and encouragement from the Iranian government's fatwa is naive. The Iranian regime's incendiary rhetoric wasn't just background noise. It actively fueled and incentivized extremist actions. When a government puts a fatwa on someone's head, it sends a chilling message that can galvanize individuals to commit unspeakable acts. Instead of letting knee-jerk politics dictate the narrative, he insists on waiting for the court to reveal the true motivations behind such attacks. This is about grounding our understanding in facts, not letting sensationalist politics cloud the issue. Abdullah's approach is a call for rigorous examination, ensuring that we address the real influences and motivations behind violent actions without succumbing to divisive and simplistic rhetoric. In this fiery debate, Abdullah al-Andalusi delivers a powerful counterpunch to Douglas Murray's sweeping generalizations and incendiary rhetoric. Murray's aggressive stance, which attempts to link terrorism to entire communities and dismisses the complexities of free speech, gets a sharp rebuttal from al-Andalusi. He calls out Murray's hypocrisy, showing how his selective support for free speech undermines the very principles he claims to champion. Al-Andalusi makes it clear that blaming whole communities for individual acts of violence is not only unjust, but dangerously divisive. By demanding a focus on actual evidence and holding perpetrators accountable, al-Andalusi champions a more nuanced, fair approach, cutting through the noise and standing up for genuine dialogue and justice. What a debate! If you're passionate about free speech and justice, hit like, share, and subscribe for more intense discussions. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Let's keep the conversation going.